Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for our social media and fundraising session. We're just going to give it a minute or two to let everyone join and then we'll get started. Hi everyone, for those that are joining, we're just going to give it maybe one more minute for just everyone to join in and then we'll get started with the webinar. Wonderful. As it's 12:01, I think we'll get started. So a big thank you all for joining us for our social media and fundraising webinar for charities. Today, I'm joined by Sahil from Big Give and of course, Teresa from Lightful, who will be leading this session. So thank you all for joining. You have the next slide, please. Just going to go over quick house rules for today's session. Just to note that if you do need a transcript for the session at all, there's a live transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom bar, which you can enable now. And it's a simple presentation with the Q&A format. So if you do have any questions at all throughout the session, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. You can also use the chat function, just set it to everyone, and you can message, introduce yourself, and talk to anyone else that's taking part in the session as well. And also just to note that the webinar is being recorded and we'll also be sharing the slides with you once the webinar has been completed. So you'll be able to access that recording and the slides again after the session. And from that, I think I'll pass straight on to Teresa. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Teresa Licha, digital engagement manager at Lightful, and I've been working with nonprofits on the digital communications front for 5 years now. And Lightful is an organization providing digital skills training for nonprofits and social enterprises. Really great to be with you all. So we're talking today about social media and fundraising, and of course, more specifically, how to use it for the Christmas challenge. And it might be good to check with you all at the chat, just to check in how many of you have joined the Christmas challenge before, just to get an idea. And it's totally fine if it's the first time. Lina says first time, that's great. Ellen, first time here, perfect. First timers. Juliet, third year. Everyone else up to now is first time. Second time, first time. Perfect. That was more like to get an idea, of course. And those of you who have joined in the past, feel free to share any tips of what worked or what you want to improve during the session. And we'll have more time with the Q&A afterwards. So why do we want to use social media as part of the Christmas challenge? There are many different ways to use your channels, but some examples are, first of all, making sure that you connect with your supporters and engage with them. You might want to announce your participation. You might want to have an active campaign or use social media along with different channels. And at the end of the day, it's all about telling a story and making sure that you want to highlight your impact. You want to make sure your supporters understand why they want to support your campaign. And this is the perfect way to reach them at the channels that they use the most. So let's look at some tips on how to plan your campaign. And obviously you have a little bit more than a month, and it's the perfect time to start thinking of the planning and how to get organized. The first step that always helps with a campaign is to think of the objectives. So what do you want to achieve when you create a campaign? It could be about awareness. So you want to make sure your supporters find out more about your work, they visit your website, and they stay up to date on what's happening. You might want to focus on engagement, get your followers to promote your campaign, be more involved, or someone who might be following you, they might want to turn into an email subscriber. So any way that counts as engagement. Or you might want to think of conversion, which is an example is turning them into donors or any specific action that means that it's an end result for you. And something that makes it more specific, because obviously it's one thing to set some goals, but you want to make sure you're able to follow up. A good idea is to turn your objectives into SMART goals. So SMART is an acronym standing for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And we have 3 examples just to make it more specific for you. So if you want to have as an objective awareness, you might want to say, instead of just saying, I want to increase my brand awareness, which is very broad and it's not really helping you to keep track, you might be more specific and say, I want to increase my Facebook impressions by 30% by the end of the year. So this is a SMART goal because it's easier to keep track of the timeline of the specific target and to see where you are during the target. Another idea, if you want to focus on fundraising, a SMART goal would be increase the amount raised in the Christmas challenge by 10% compared to 2021. So anything that can be more specific, it's always a good idea because it's easier for you to see how you're doing and what you want to improve. So it's definitely a good time now to start thinking, how can I set a target for my campaign? And it doesn't mean that you would have to reach it 100%. It's still more of an idea of what you want to get out of your campaign. The next stage for the planning, and it's obviously very important, you want to think of your audience. Who do you want to reach with your campaign? And obviously, it's not just one set number of people in demographics. There are many different ones, especially on social media. So it's important when you create content to make sure that you do keep in mind who is going to read your posts. So there could be your supporters, your staff, your volunteers, the board or the trustees. Obviously, there are the donors, there are the corporate partners, and there could also be the social media or newsletter followers who might not necessarily fall into these categories. Or there could be cases where someone overlaps in between these. So you want to think, for example, what's the difference between the trustees and the donors, or the corporate partners and the volunteers? So this is always very helpful when you create content, because you start thinking like them. How can I create content that makes sense for them? And I encourage them to support my campaign. And just to make it more specific, when you're thinking, who do you want to reach? Then you want to think, what's the right channel, the right way to get in touch with that specific audience? So supporters, for example, they could be on social media, it could be on email, it could be online communities. But the difference, for example, with corporate partners or the board and the trustees, these could be more on a professional focus. So they might be spending more time on LinkedIn and they might not be active on Facebook and Instagram. But you may also have an opportunity to reach them on email. So it's not just about thinking only about social media, it's about all the digital channels and what makes more sense for the different audiences. And speaking of channels, obviously, let's have a quick overview in terms of all the most popular social media channels and how you can use them as part of your Christmas challenge. Obviously, we're starting with Facebook as the most popular channel through the years, and it's a good idea to use Facebook if you want to reach friends or friends of friends. So obviously, Facebook is a personal network, and there is a very big number of users, and that means that there is a great opportunity if you encourage your staff, your volunteers, your supporters, your donors to promote your campaign. Then that means that if they share it on their profiles, then their friends can also see that. So it's not just about one person, it's also the network that they bring for you. And in terms of Facebook, it works really well if you want to use videos. You might want to explore some time to do live streaming. So it would be the start of the campaign. It may be an opportunity, an event, something that's happening in your team. Or you might want to explore any communities where your supporters, your volunteers, your donors might be spending time. And for those of you who want to go a little bit further, there's obviously the opportunity for advertising or boosting your posts in terms of making sure that you reach more people. And something about Facebook ads specifically about the Christmas challenge and Big Give, in case you're interested, of course, we need to remember that you can't add the Facebook pixel to the Big Give page. So that means that you can create ads in general, but you can bring them directly to the website in order to retarget them in the future. And of course, the Big Give team is always happy to help with that if you have any questions as you're planning the campaign. And let's look at all the other channels. So Twitter, obviously, it's very different from Facebook. And the most important change is that it's a very specific limit. There are 280 characters, so you have to be very specific with your content. It's usually 2 to 3 sentences. So you want to make sure that you're clear with the message, that it's easy to understand, and that it's not really confusing. Something very important, you want to make sure you use the hashtag Christmas Challenge 22. And this is always a really good way to look at other posts, find inspiration. And it's also great for the Big Give team to look at all the posts and highlight all the great stories. So definitely make sure you use the hashtag. And what really works on Twitter is trying to be more engaging, be more casual, and think that you want to make sure you capture someone's attention. Things change really fast on Twitter, so you want to use experiment with GIFs, with videos, with images that really grab someone's attention. Because if you just only add text, it's very easy to get lost on Twitter. So make sure you try out maybe with like multiple images or any updates that you want to share during the campaign. And as you can see at the example that we used on the screenshot, you can also use a quote in a way that really stands out and think, how can I really use the content that I have in more creative ways? And in terms of the audience for Twitter, it's great to use it for supporters, for volunteers, for donors, but it's also great if you want to think of influencers and journalists, and if you feel like there's a local element in your story or someone in your network that might benefit from spreading the word. And then we're going into LinkedIn, which is very different from the other two, but it's a very specific use. And it's sometimes a really big benefit knowing exactly how you want to use a channel. So LinkedIn is more professional, and it's a great idea to try and activate your staff, your ambassadors, your volunteers who might be on LinkedIn, and think of the corporate angle. How can you focus on partnerships, on any relationships that you might have, or any new opportunities that might come across? The good thing is you don't need too many posts on LinkedIn, and engaging posts can stay for many days on someone's feeds. So you could schedule a post, let's say, for like once a week, and make sure that it's really engaging. There are still images, videos, and you still tell a story. But think of the audience and how it changes and how it has a little bit more of a professional focus. And then there's Instagram, a very engaging channel. And this is all about creative storytelling, really, and a visual focus. So obviously every post should have something visual. It could be an image, could be a video, and you want to make sure that it really stands out. It's definitely important to also have a really good caption. And we've seen many charities that are really focusing on storytelling as part of a long caption that explains the image. But all these two should really go together. It's about both the image and the caption. And Instagram is also really useful in thinking of building a community. So it's not just about the campaign. You also want to use it as a long-term win. How can you create content that really stands out, that someone sees that and they feel that they would like to stay in touch with your organization? And then you turn them into engaged supporters in the future. So you might want to explore other options if you want to be more creative. You want to share Instagram stories, so it's something that only lasts for 24 hours. So you can just be more casual, try to be more engaging with your supporters. Or the new types of videos on Instagram called Reels. They're also very engaging, and there are videos that last longer, more than a minute than it used to be on Instagram. So when it comes to the audience, this is about the supporters, the donors, the volunteers, and it can be a wide audience in that case, but still you want to make sure that everything you create, you still have the audience in mind. So how can you tell an interesting story that it's engaging and also visually appealing? And then there's TikTok, which is new, but also very engaging. And there are some charities who are getting into it and, of course, trying to give it a try compared to the others. And there are many lessons to learn, and it's still very early stage, but still mentioning as an idea if you want to experiment with it. It's obviously very engaging in general. So 60% of users are Gen Z. So many charities are starting to use it to try and engage a younger audience. And the content is unique, so you need to start using it a little bit more on your own in order to understand how to create content. And something that's really useful from what I've seen from the charities that already jumped on TikTok, it's really important to build the community first before getting into fundraising. So you want to understand how can I use it if you want to reach a younger generation, maybe to create some posts beforehand, before I launch my campaign and I make the fundraising ask. And if you haven't already used that, keep in mind that you don't necessarily need to spend too much time if it's brand new, but it still might be a good idea as an experiment if you feel like you have a little bit more time and you want to explore that for the longer term. So just a recap of what we discussed in terms of the different channels and the different uses. So Facebook, you can use it, of course, for a wider audience and also tap into personal networks. Then there's Twitter, which is more about the hashtags and bite-sized content. We've got LinkedIn, which is more about the corporate network, the staff, the partners. There's Instagram, which is all about storytelling and engaging content. There are groups, which I had in mind as Facebook groups, but in general, any sort of community online that you feel that you can really tap into them and try to engage them. And then there are the additional creative options, could be TikTok, Twitch, Pinterest, if you want to explore if your audience is there or if you want at some point to give them a try. And just an overview pretty much of what we discussed in terms of planning. When you create your campaign, you want to think of the objectives first. Then it's time to think of the audience, and these two go together. So what do you want to achieve and who do you want to reach as part of the campaign? Then you go into the planning stage, think of the channels that you want to use, maybe the frequency of posting, and if you want any help within your team. And then there's the actual content and measuring it. So this is a really simple overview of thinking of a campaign. And this could be a campaign strategy, really. And you don't need to go into full detail. It's still more of having an idea of how to plan a campaign and try to organize yourself as much as possible. So let's look at the stage when you start preparing the content, when you are already aware of what you want to achieve, your goals, your audience, the channels you want to use, so you want to be a little bit more practical. The first thing you need to do is to think of the theme for your campaign. You might want to start with the hashtag if you want to have a hashtag on your own, or you can just use Christmas Challenge 22. You want to think what your asks. So when you're creating the content on all different posts, all different channels, what's the main ask? What do you want to ask your supporters? So if it's about the donation and getting them into your fundraising page, how can you make sure that you have a very clear message? It's simple, it's easy to understand, and they know what they need to do. So you don't want to confuse them. You don't want to ask too many things. And it's always useful to focus on the story, on really about sharing the impact. And when it comes to the specific campaign, of course, the idea of doubling the impact is very important on storytelling. And something that's always really useful is keep in mind that it's not just about you as an organization, it's also about the supporters. So think, how can you make sure that you make them understand in the message that they can really make a difference, even with a small contribution? Then the next stage, you want to start collecting stories. It's definitely a good idea to always start with your existing content. It might be any existing stories, images, videos, anything that you feel that you already have and you don't need to create from scratch. It's definitely good to organize them all in one folder, images, videos, any stories, and try to get as organized as possible early before it gets really overwhelming in the end. And then look at your existing stories, all the stories you want to collect, and start creating a narrative. How can you bring all the stories together to make sure that the narrative of the campaign makes sense for someone? So if someone sees the first post and then a post a few days after, how can they still understand that it's part of the same campaign? There needs to be back linked to the theme, as we've said. And if you need help with images, there are definitely many tools online. One of the most popular ones is Canva. So you can just experiment with all the different templates that they have. You just add your text and it's very easy to create many images. Then it's time to think of the actual post and how to start planning your content. So it's definitely a good idea to plan your content early and schedule them if you can. And you don't necessarily need to plan every single thing. But the more you are organized, the easier it becomes to have more time in the end. I don't feel that you really need to rush things. And when you create the different stories, as we mentioned earlier about the narrative, think of the campaign as a longer story, and you're just telling a long story through different posts. So how can one post be linked to the other and still have them all connected with the main theme? And then you want to think the visual content, the images you create, how do they still tell the story along with the copy and the text? So all these should be linked together, and make sure that when someone sees the photo, that there's also a connection with what you're writing in the caption of it. And when you create all the content, you want to think of a launch of the campaign. You want to schedule a post to announce your participation, and then at the start of the campaign to start building the excitement, to make your supporters feel involved and really encourage them to be part of the campaign to keep the momentum going. And this is a content calendar that we're sharing with many organizations when they're getting started, and we're happy to share that after the webinar. So it's a very simple content calendar that is useful when you want to create content for different channels. So you start writing down, it's a spreadsheet, the different posts that you want to share, let's say for Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, the time you want to share that, the copy, the link. And this makes it a little bit easier to get organized, unless you want to use a social media tool, of course, and see what works best for you, how you can get more organized to make sure that everything makes sense of your end. Once you create the content and you're still in the planning stage, you definitely want to think of outreach, because the campaign is only successful if you have a strong network, and it doesn't have to be a network starting from scratch. It's all about thinking who is able to support my campaign. And obviously you're starting from the staff, from the volunteers. You want to make sure that your board and your trustees are also aware of the campaign, and they can still promote it to their own networks in the channels that they may be using. And then, of course, you also want to encourage your partners, your existing or older donors, or your current followers to really feel part of the campaign. So someone might not be ready to donate if it's a social media follower, but if they're still able to support you by sharing your posts and spreading the word for your campaign, then that's still important for you, because you are expanding your reach and you're tapping into a new network. So think, how can you really make the most of all the different audiences to get them to do at least one action, whether it's about sharing, donating, spreading the word, any support, everything is welcome. And then it's time for the launch of the campaign. And this is the time when you want to have a last minute check. For example, it might be a good idea to update your social media cover photos to make them all about the campaign. You want to announce on the day the start of the post having as a starting point, so all your channels are up to date. This is the time, what we just mentioned, you want to encourage your network, especially at the start, to spread the word. And it's the perfect opportunity, let's say at the first day, to get everyone to support you, because this really makes the start even easier for you and more engaging. And then when you start, of course, this is only the starting point. It's not a campaign that lasts one day, so you want to make sure that continue engaging with your community. And you're thinking of different ways, how can I keep the momentum going and encourage them to continue with the support? So pretty much what we discussed, there were 5 points in terms of getting organized with your campaign. First of all, you want to think of the theme and what your campaign is about. Then you want to collect the stories and get organized. Then once you have the stories, you start planning the content to get a better idea of what you want to share. Then it's time for the outreach, and make sure you connect your network as much as possible to any opportunities on how they can support you. And then it's time for the launch of a campaign where everything should be organized and you're ready to start engaging more with your supporters. And just another thing to remember, and we mentioned that earlier, any contributions should be welcome, and it's important to mention that as part of your messaging. So social media, there were many studies showing pretty much through the last years that it's not always about the really big donations. In many cases, they might not come from social media, but it's really important to focus on the idea of micro donations. So the idea of focusing on doubling the impact and why it's important for someone to donate as part of a specific campaign. It's really encouraging someone, even if they want to contribute to 5 or 10 pounds, it's still a big win for you. If they haven't donated in the past, there are still new donors for you. Or there might have been lapsed donors that haven't donated for years, and they still feel that this is a really interesting campaign. I want to get back and support the organization. And it's only the start of the relationship. So you want to cultivate the relationship with them and make sure they also contribute to future campaigns. So definitely don't underestimate the use of social media, whether it's about engagement or just building the long-term relationships with your donors. So now we're finishing the campaign. It's right after the end. And there are a couple of tips to remember on what you need to do right after. So when you're done with the campaign and we see many posts like that, it's definitely important to thank your donors and your supporters. Anyone who supported your campaign with a like, a comment, a share, it's still someone you need to thank. So we've seen many cases of posts where there's a really nice, engaging and visual thank you, and you're usually sharing the update of how many contributed to your campaign, the total amount you raised, the number of donors, anything that you feel you want to share. And it's on one hand, it's about communicating the impact, but it's also important because you really make everyone who supports your campaign feel involved and appreciated. So it's a really important post, and you might want to share the day after. You might want to wait for a few days to make sure you have final numbers, but it's always important to make sure that you have such posts. And then on your end, it's definitely a good idea to start looking at what you can improve in your next campaign. And for those of you that are having the first campaign, it's obviously good to see what you can learn from the first campaign, what you want to improve on any numbers that you want to collect, whether it's about the donors, the amount raised, any social media success. For example, you might have gained a few followers, maybe the engagement was better. Anything that you feel like you learned from the first campaign and what you want to improve in the future. And what we need obviously to remember, it's about building the relationships. So it doesn't mean that at the end of the campaign that you want to engage again with your supporters. So you want to think, how can I continue my social media presence to make sure that they still feel that they can access more content until the next time that I make the fundraising ask. And this is an example from a participating organization who joined the Christmas challenge. So this is StandOut. And they ran the first Christmas challenge in 2020. So the goal was to raise £30,000, and they managed to raise in the end a little bit more than 42,000, almost 43,000 pounds, with 104 online donations. So what was interesting is that 92 of their supporters were new donors, and obviously that's something really important. And you want to think when you are in that stage and almost all your supporters were new donors, how can you continue the relationship? How can you make sure that they're still engaged in the future to continue supporting you? And what was also great is that on top of the online donations, there were almost a little bit more than 28,000 pounds raised on offline donations. And going beyond the fundraising part, there were also 40 new subscribers for their channels. So this is pretty much an idea on how to measure the success of the campaign. Obviously, you start with fundraising, but you also want to see, are there any other wins, anything that I can learn? And a tip from them, and that was part of the case study for Big Give that they shared, is how pretty much they organize the campaign in 4 steps. First, you need to plan, as we mentioned. Then you need to engage and bring the campaign to life. Then it's time to promote and reach out to your networks. And of course, as we said, trying to send personalized thanks to your supporters. And that's pretty much it on my end. It was more of an overview on how to use social media and start planning your campaign. And especially for those who are new to planning your campaign for the first time, it's more about finding out what works best for you. Obviously, these are more of guidelines, and you want to see what works for you based on your time, your resources, or what you want to get out of the campaign. So feel free to share at the chat any thoughts. Those of you who are getting started or those who ran a campaign last year, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Teresa, and really great presentation. We did have a couple of questions come in.
Perfect.
There's one from Ben, and he asks, how long before the start date should you launch your campaign?
Really good question. It really depends. I've heard many cases of starting the campaign very early. So very early could be early in October. But in most cases, what I've seen is usually a month before or around that time, let's say early November, because you don't want to have it too early, because if you announce it on social media, for example, and say that we're joining the campaign, keep an eye on our updates, then you don't want your supporters to forget that it's actually happening. So it's probably a good idea to start thinking of the planning stages, as we said, a little bit before of a month. And so you can do that behind the scenes, let's say in 5-6 weeks time. And it's probably best to announce it on social media a couple of weeks before.
Beth, we can't hear. I don't know if your microphone's just come out. We can't hear you. Doesn't look like you're on mute.
Is any
Yeah.
better?
Yeah, we can
hear
hear
you.
you now.
Fab, great. So if you're a small charity, say only one social media person there, would you recommend focusing on one or two channels or trying to do a range?
Yes, it's probably best, especially when you're a very small team, to focus on the channels that work best for you. So if you're acting on Facebook and Instagram, then it's probably a good idea to stay with them at the point. Because if you start thinking, how can I create content on like 5 channels, even if you just share the same thing, you still need to keep an eye on the channels for the engagement, for the measurement afterwards. So it gets more complicated. So that also applies to organizations, even with like 4, 5, 6 members. If you feel that you want to be more specific and you want to get results because, for example, Instagram might be working great for you. So it's definitely a good idea to be more specific rather than just spend time on too many channels at the time.
And do you happen to have any data on what's the most engaging sort of content? For example, videos, reels, donor stories, beneficiary stories? So
I always like looking at the campaigns, and also for Christmas Challenge, I was looking back at the stories from last year. And the posts that really stand out are usually images and videos, and obviously reels are really good for Instagram. But it's not just about the type of content, it's also about the stories. So definitely photos and content around the beneficiaries or how you make the impact, or something that looks creative. So for example, I shared a slide earlier, I can find it back. It was on Instagram where it was a post showing pretty much before and after. So this is a really nice visual way to highlight the impact. If you have a specific goal and you want to build something, sharing a photo that is split in two and you present before and after, it's a really nice way to show the impact in a way that everyone understands. So you want to think first, what's the available content that I have? And then how can I make sure that I use the ways of working for social channels, so like videos, images, to really tell the story.
And we had one question come in from Nina here, and it says, if you're considering paid ads, how much budget do you advise in relation to the total fundraising target? And just before to jump in, we do have an advanced session on Wednesday where we'll be covering ads a bit more as well. So you may want to, if you're interested in ads, you may be interested in that session.
Yeah, I think the budget really depends in general on your available budget for a campaign and how much you want to invest in that. I've heard many different cases. It could be from £100 as part of the campaign as a test to engage and boost the posts, to obviously a way higher budget. But what's important is also to consider what we mentioned earlier about the Facebook pixel. So pretty much the fact that you want to direct your users to the Big Give page, it means that you can't install or use the pixel. So you can't use again those that you're targeting to reach them out in the future. So this is definitely something to consider, because you can still, of course, run ads. But if you want to use that money and the budget in a way that you can still target this audience in the future, then you won't be able to do that as part of the specific campaign. So it's also something to consider for the budget.
And on ads, we had a question from Elena. I hope I pronounced that right. Do you think advertising through Google Ads is useful? And do you think we should use them? And what sort of thing would you recommend adding? I would just like to caveat this as well, is that we use, obviously there's the Google Ads grants for charities, and we use that as well, which is really great. There is also a service that Google offers where they sort of help sort of mentoring scheme with a professional or student to help you use Google Ad grants. You can try using that, but my experience with that scheme is not great because the people weren't responsive on email. But if you do want, from my experience, if you do want to use Google Ads and you haven't used them before, I would say start learning about it now, because it's quite a lot of things to learn.
And it's definitely useful in general, and obviously you can use the grant for nonprofits, but it's not necessarily the kind of advertising that it's last minute to make sure you boost the campaign. It's about the awareness and like the bigger picture. So it's very different on that front compared to Facebook, for example, where it's very specific.
Great. And I know this might be specific for this organization, but is there a best day to post, e.g. twice a week, that you'd recommend?
So there is definitely, you might want to look, for example, on Facebook. If you go into your analytics, it's called Insights on Facebook. you can see the best performing days for your posts. So that reflects your organization. So it might say, for example, the best engagement was on Tuesday and Thursday and usually in the evening. So this gets you a really good idea based on your own stats and data. But in general, in terms of the frequency, you want to think what makes sense for your organization and your resources. So we try not to have too many posts as a recommendation, because the more you post, the more the engagement and the reach might be spread. But when it comes to a campaign in a specific intensive period, you might want to think, how can I increase the frequency a little bit more than what I used to do without spending too much time, for example, like 3 posts a day on every channel? You definitely don't want to overdo it.
Great. And Sahil, did you have any questions?
Yeah. So there's a question from Laura who's asked, we've decided to start a public awareness raising campaign 2 weeks before, but we'll be contacting our closest donors at the beginning of November. Sorry, I think that's, oh, sorry, that wasn't a question. Sorry, my bad. I thought that was, that's just a comment. There is a question as well about, would you recommend tagging or interacting with our campaigns in social media tips, and any social media posts, and any tips on doing so? None of our champions are on social media. I will double check that. 1 or 2 may be available on LinkedIn. And if they've already said that they want to sort of be known publicly, then we'll share their social media links with you. But for the most part, our champions aren't on social media. If they are happy to be known publicly, then, and they do have social media links, then you can absolutely tag them in any post, and they'll be happy to be tagged in any social media posts that you put out there. And sorry.
So yeah, I just saw a question about a session on how to use Canva. Big Give won't be holding a session on that, but we do have a resource that's given to us by Giving Tuesday, and they have a link to a YouTube session to talk about how to use Canva and how to maximize that. So I'll just put that in the chat quickly, and it's also in the resources section of your portal if you want to have a look at that. I don't know if like we'll have any resources on that.
Yeah, I was actually seeing that session a few days ago, and it was really useful, because if you're looking for a video, the training on how to use Canva, you can really get some examples on how to make the most of it and how to create a quick image. So it's definitely a good one.
Great. I had a question about, so I don't use Instagram or TikTok, but obviously if you're using stories and reels on Instagram, is it easy, or would you advise replicating that content on TikTok? And is that a good way to sort of cover both platforms, or would you advise against that?
So it's definitely a good start. But the thing with TikTok, and what I've realized, because I've seen also a couple of case studies from charities that recently joined TikTok, and there are still not many, but you can still get an idea on how they're using it. And one of the recommendations on how they get started was look at what's happening on TikTok in terms of the creative uses and trying to create content specifically for the channel. So it's a good way to have more content when you create reels, for example, and use them also on TikTok. But if you really want to be serious at some point and spend more time, then it's probably dedicating more time to understand that. And obviously, again, there are not many charities yet, and it's usually some bigger ones. But sooner or later, I guess it will just be added on our social media schedule.
And I guess a question probably more linked to Instagram, but in general as well, is it best to put the hashtags in the post itself or in the comments?
Interesting. That's a really good question. I was literally reading a story about that last week, and there was a research that pretty much said that there really isn't a big difference in the end. So there's always someone saying it's better to have it in the comments or have it in the post, but it doesn't really make a difference in the engagement from what they've seen. I tend to add them in the copy, but there are many others who add it in a comment. So feel free to see what works best for you.
And maybe one for Sahil here, would you, is it good to tag those who've pledged to the campaign? What would you recommend on that?
So if you're talking about your pledges, yeah, that's, yeah, you can tag them. I guess that's the conversation you want to have with your pledges. Obviously be aware with the character limits on Twitter, so you want to be aware that if you're tagging, if you have multiple pages and you tag them in your post, it's probably going to be like not enough to get the rest of the post in. But yeah, probably maybe for LinkedIn and Facebook, it's more appropriate, and that's something that you would want to discuss with your pages. There is a question from Laura. Is there a way to target certain demographic and location through Instagram and TikTok? She knows you can do this for Facebook, but not. She hasn't got any experience with any other platforms.
So I think if you want to have organic posts and not advertising, I don't think you can do it on Instagram and TikTok yet, because Facebook is obviously more ahead on many functions. But if you want to be more specific, you might want to try the advertising part, as we've said, or maybe boost your posts, which doesn't have to be a big budget. But if you want to make sure that a specific demographic or a location, they really look at your posts, you might want to use a really small budget to boost your content.
Great. There's a question as well from Georgie Butler. They've tried doing reels, however, they weren't able to tag the trendy audios that are going around. What do you recommend? Using trends going around, or adding the non-copyright music instead, which might not be as engaging?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. And I remember, for example, so I'm originally Greek. When I was in Greece, I wasn't able to access the music that was playing on Reels. So that also depends on every country, which is interesting to consider. And I would say in that case, try to create content with the original sound. So if there is a way to just avoid having music, obviously you don't want to have copyright music if not everyone can hear that. Or if it's not copyright music that you feel that it's not engaging, then you might want to skip that and think, how can I create a story, for example, where you get to hear the sound rather than just adding additional music.
Great. And I think there's a question that just come in from Claire. She says, how do you target location on Facebook?
So this is a function when you create the posts. I think what I've heard in the past, not everyone was able to access it. And I can find the link. There used to be some guidelines on Facebook on how to access it if we want to share it after. But it should be when you create the post, right at the top of the post, you see some options. And I think there is like a globe button and you can select a specific audience.
Great. I think that's actually most of the questions, but it'd be good to know if you had any more top tips for charities for planning their campaign.
I'd love to hear from those who joined last year or 2 years ago, as some of you said. If there are any tips that we missed, anything that you would recommend to someone having the campaign for the first time.
I think my tip would definitely be use Beth will probably have more to say on this, is definitely to use like a scheduling tool like Buffer to help plan everything, especially during the campaign week. I know that's really busy. I don't know if Beth, you want to chime in there.
Yep, definitely. Scheduling is definitely a big one for me, but I'd also say just plan ahead as much as you can. I think what we see some charities, feedback is that the campaign can go really quickly. So having that content already planned and potentially thinking about different scenarios that could happen. For example, you've reached your target 2 days into the campaign. That's great. Do you have a message for that? Do you have some copy already prepared for that? Or maybe it's 2 days until the campaign ends and you haven't reached your target yet. Have you got some more copy there, or a case study or a video or something that you can share to really push people to donate for those last 2 days? Just kind of thinking about those campaign scenarios as well, and having something prepared in advance could really be quite helpful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's one thing to share some posts in advance, but you also need to keep an eye on what's happening during the campaign and adjust that.
There is a question, I think this is for Beth, is what has a Big Give got planned to promote the campaign?
Yeah, so Big Give do a lot of press in general about the campaign. We're working with our press agency to hopefully have a report coming out. We're also going to have a campaign video as usual, which we'll share with all of you as well. And we're doing continuous social media throughout the day, also sharing with our networks and thousands of people on our donor list as well. So yeah, we're just going to be doing a big push as usual for the Christmas Challenge campaign, and we've added assets and resources in the support section of the charity portal if you do need help there, including some key messages that might support you with framing your campaign as well.
I think that's all the questions now. So I think we can wrap up here. Thank you again, Teresa, for
Thanks so much.
Joining us today, doing this webinar. Thanks to all the attendees for joining us today as well and asking great questions. Reminder, we do have the webinar on Wednesday, so if you want to go, this was laying the sort of building blocks of social media. So if you want to find out more in depth about it and especially about ads, please do join us on Wednesday. We'll be putting this recording on our YouTube channel along with the slides. So if you want to watch that back, it will be available in your resources for you very soon. With that in mind, I hope everyone has a great day. Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. See you.
Thanks.